Rebecca Hayes arrived at Fort Benning every morning at 5 o'clock sharp, an hour before the first soldiers began their day. Her weathered pickup truck, at least 10 years old, always claimed the same parking spot near the weapons maintenance facility, the same black coffee in the same dented thermos, the same measured steps through the entrance that had become as routine as breathing. To everyone on base, Rebecca was just another civilian contractor. Competent, reliable, but unremarkable. She kept her blonde hair pulled back in a practical ponytail, wore simple jeans and plain shirts, and never joined the other maintenance staff for drinks after work. Her colleagues respected her work but knew almost nothing about her life beyond these walls. Her apartment sat 3 miles from base, a modest one-bedroom with beige walls and minimal furniture. No photographs adorned the surfaces. No medals displayed in shadow boxes. No hints of a life beyond the simple routine she had maintained for 3 years. The only personal touch was a small wooden box on her nightstand that she never opened. In front of anyone, Rebecca's workstation reflected the same simplicity. Tools arranged with mathematical precision. Each weapon she touched received the kind of attention most people reserve for newborn babies. Other maintenance staff joked that she treated every rifle like it might save the world, never knowing how many times her perfectly maintained weapons actually had. When pressed about her background, Rebecca deflected questions with practiced ease. She mentioned a general interest in firearms, some time at shooting ranges growing up. Nothing that would raise eyebrows or invite further inquiry. Her movements were efficient but never flashy, her expertise hidden beneath layers of deliberate ordinariness. But every morning, before anyone else arrived, Rebecca performed a ritual that would have revealed everything. 100 push-ups in the empty maintenance bay, counting silently, not for fitness, but for remembrance. Each repetition a name, a face, a life that had shaped her into someone she could barely recognize anymore. The wooden box in her apartment contained 5 sets of dog tags, worn smooth by years of handling. 5 names she whispered during those morning exercises. 5 souls who had trusted her with their lives and lost them anyway. The weight of those tags had driven her from a world where legends were born to one where she could serve without the burden of being remembered. Rebecca Hayes was a ghost in more ways than one. She had deliberately erased every trace of who she used to be, every hint of the skills that had once made her name whispered in reverence and fear across 17 countries. The quiet contractor who arrived early and left late, who never missed a deadline and never complained about overtime, was exactly what she wanted to be. But ghosts have a way of being discovered, especially when they try too hard to stay hidden. And at Fort Benning, where military precision met civilian oversight, where young soldiers learned to trust their equipment with their lives, the past had a way of catching up with those who thought they could outrun it. The morning Rebecca's carefully constructed anonymity began to crumble started like any other. Coffee, push-ups, and the familiar weight of responsibility settling on her shoulders as she began another day of maintenance work. She had no way of knowing that Colonel James Harrison had been watching her for weeks, or that his observations would soon shatter the peaceful obscurity she had worked so hard to build. The first sign of trouble came when Harrison appeared in the maintenance bay earlier than usual, his polished boots clicking against the concrete floor with deliberate authority. He carried himself like a man who had never doubted his place in the world, never questioned his right to judge others. His eyes swept the workspace with the confidence of someone looking for problems rather than solutions. Rebecca felt his gaze settle on her workstation, measuring and evaluating with the intensity of a predator sizing up prey. She continued her work without acknowledgement, focusing on the rifle disassembly that had become second nature. But something in the air had changed, a tension that made her shoulders tighten despite her best efforts to remain calm. Harrison's voice cut through the morning quiet like a blade. "Ace, isn't it? I've been reviewing your personnel file." The words carried an edge that made other maintenance staff glance up from their work, sensing the shift in atmosphere that preceded storms. Rebecca looked up from her work, meeting his gaze with the same neutral expression she wore like armor. "Yes, sir. Is there something you need?" "Just getting to know our civilian contractors better," Harrison replied, his smile never reaching his eyes. "Making sure everyone understands the standards we maintain here at Fort Benning." The implication hung in the air between them, unspoken but clear. Rebecca had dealt with men like Harrison before, officers who confused authority with competence, who mistook volume for leadership. She nodded politely and returned to her work, hoping silence would end the conversation before it could begin. But Harrison wasn't finished. 3 years here, and you've never applied for additional training? Never sought advancement? Most contractors show some ambition. The question carried undertones that made Rebecca's jaw tighten almost imperceptibly. She had learned to read men like Harrison, to understand the games they played and the insecurities that drove them. This was about more than performance reviews or career advancement. This was about control, about establishing dominance in a world where he felt his authority might be questioned. "I'm satisfied with my current position," Rebecca replied evenly. "The work is meaningful." Harrison's laugh carried no humor. "Meaningful? You clean weapons, Hayes. Important work, certainly, but let's not pretend it requires special expertise." The words stung more than they should have, cutting through defenses Rebecca had thought were stronger. She had chosen this work precisely because it was meaningful, because every weapon she maintained might keep someone's son or daughter alive in a place where precision meant survival. But explaining that would require revealing more than she was willing to share. "I understand, sir," she said instead, her voice carrying none of the thoughts racing through her mind. Harrison studied her for a long moment, as if expecting some reaction he could use to justify whatever he had already decided. When none came, he moved on to inspect other workstations, but Rebecca could feel his attention returning to her throughout. The morning like a weight pressing down on her shoulders. The other maintenance staff exchanged glances after Harrison left, their expressions mixing sympathy with relief that they hadn't been the target of his scrutiny. Rebecca appreciated their unspoken support, but she also understood the reality of their situation. Harrison's authority extended far beyond the maintenance bay, and none of them could afford to make him an enemy. As the day progressed, Rebecca found herself thinking about the wooden box in her apartment, about the name she carried and the reasons she had chosen this life. She had thought 3 years of anonymity would be enough, that she could serve quietly without anyone questioning her qualifications or her past. But men like Harrison didn't believe in quiet service. They believed in hierarchy, in putting people in their proper places, in making sure everyone understood exactly where they stood. The afternoon brought new challenges as Harrison returned, with additional questions about her work methods, her efficiency reports, and her interaction with base personnel. Each inquiry felt like a probe, testing for weaknesses he could exploit. Rebecca answered with professional courtesy, but inside, she felt the familiar stirring of instincts she had worked hard to suppress. She had faced down enemies in hostile territory, had stared death in the face, and pulled the trigger when necessary. But this was different. This was about the life she had built, the peace she had found, the service she provided without recognition or glory. Harrison threatened all of that with his questions and his assumptions and his obvious intent to find fault where none existed. As the day ended and Rebecca prepared to leave for her apartment, she carried with her the certainty that this was only the beginning. Harrison had marked her as a target, and men like him didn't give up easily. The quiet contractor who had hoped to serve without notice was about to discover that some fights chose you, regardless of how far you ran or how deep you buried your past. The drive home gave her time to think, to plan, to prepare for whatever Harrison had in mind. She had survived worse than office politics and petty authority. But she had also learned that sometimes the greatest battles were fought not with weapons, but with patience, with precision, and with the kind of quiet strength that didn't need to announce itself to be effective. Rebecca Hayes was about to be tested in ways she hadn't expected. And somewhere deep inside, beneath the layers of careful anonymity and deliberate ordinariness, the ghost began to stir. The harassment began subtly, the way it always did with men like Colonel Harrison. Small criticisms disguised as helpful suggestions. Additional paperwork that other contractors weren't required to complete. Scheduling changes that disrupted Rebecca's carefully maintained routine without any explanation or apology. Rebecca recognized the pattern immediately. She had seen it before, in different contexts, with different stakes. The systematic application of pressure designed to break down resistance, to force a reaction that could be used to justify whatever punishment Harrison had already decided she deserved. She absorbed each slight with the same quiet acceptance she brought to everything else, but beneath the surface, familiar instincts began to sharpen. The first major escalation came during a routine inspection of the maintenance facility. Harrison arrived with a clipboard and an attitude that made it clear he was looking for problems rather than solutions. He scrutinized every workstation with exaggerated care, making notes that seemed designed more for theater than actual evaluation. When he reached Rebecca's area, his inspection became noticeably more thorough. He examined tools that had been arranged with military precision, questioned organizational systems that had proven their efficiency over 3 years of flawless performance, and found fault with methods that exceeded every standard the base had established. "This arrangement doesn't follow standard protocol," Harrison announced, pointing to a tool organization system that actually improved efficiency by 30%. Military facilities require uniformity, not personal preference. Rebecca looked at the arrangement that had been praised by every supervisor she had worked under, the system that had been copied by other maintenance staff because of its effectiveness. "Sir, this layout has been approved by previous inspections. It reduces maintenance time and improves accuracy." Harrison's expression suggested he considered her response a form of insubordination. "Previous inspections weren't conducted by me, Hayes. I'm implementing new standards, and they apply to everyone equally." The emphasis on everyone made it clear that the new standards were specifically designed with Rebecca in mind. She nodded without argument, understanding that resistance would only escalate the conflict. But as she began rearranging her workstation to meet arbitrary requirements that would actually reduce efficiency, she felt the familiar stirring of something she had worked hard to suppress. The systematic harassment continued throughout the week. Harrison found reasons to question every aspect of Rebecca's work, from her arrival time to her interaction with base personnel. He scheduled her for weekend duties that other contractors weren't required to perform, assigned her additional paperwork that served no practical purpose, and made it clear that her contract renewal depended entirely on his recommendation. Other maintenance staff watched the persecution with growing discomfort, but their sympathy came with limitations. Harrison's authority extended far beyond the maintenance bay, and none of them could afford to make him an enemy. They offered Rebecca small gestures of support, shared looks of understanding, and occasional words of encouragement, but they couldn't protect her from the campaign being waged against her. The breaking point came during a mandatory safety briefing that Harrison had called specifically to address deficiencies in contractor performance. Rebecca sat in the third row of the assembled maintenance staff, surrounded by colleagues who knew her work spoke louder than any criticism, while Harrison prepared to make her an example. Excellence in military maintenance requires more than technical competence. Harrison began, his voice carrying the authority of someone who had never doubted his right to judge others. It requires understanding of military culture, respect for chain of command, and commitment to standards that go beyond civilian expectations. The words were carefully chosen, designed to question not just Rebecca's performance, but her right to work alongside military personnel. She felt the weight of every gaze in the room, some sympathetic, others merely curious about how this confrontation would unfold. Harrison clicked through a presentation that seemed designed specifically to undermine her. Charts showing maintenance times that didn't account for the additional quality checks she performed. Graphs comparing her methods to arbitrary standards that bore no relationship to actual effectiveness. Statistics that painted her thoroughness as inefficiency and her precision as obstruction. Some contractors seem to believe that their personal preferences override established military protocols, Harrison continued, his gaze finding Rebecca in the crowd. This kind of attitude undermines unit cohesion and creates unnecessary complications in our operations. The accusation hung in the air like a challenge. Rebecca felt her hands tighten into fists before she consciously relaxed them, calling on training that went deeper than muscle memory. She had faced down enemies in hostile territory, had stared death in the face, and pulled the trigger when necessary. But this was different. This was about the life she had built, the peace she had found, the service she provided without recognition or glory. "Hayes," Harrison called out, his voice cutting through the tension in the room. "Perhaps you'd like to explain why you've been resistant to adopting standard protocols." The question was a trap, designed to elicit a response that could be used to justify whatever punishment he had already decided she deserved. Rebecca understood the game being played, the psychology behind the public confrontation, the way authority could be weaponized against those who couldn't fight back. She stood slowly, her movements controlled and deliberate. "Sir, I've implemented every protocol you've requested. My work continues to meet or exceed all established standards." Harrison's smile carried no warmth. "Meeting standards isn't the same as embracing them, Hayes. Military culture requires buy-in, not just compliance." The words stung more than they should have, cutting through defenses Rebecca had thought were stronger. She had chosen this work precisely because she understood military culture better than most, because she knew what it meant to trust your equipment with your life. But explaining that would require revealing more than she was willing to share. "I understand, sir," she replied, her voice carrying none of the thoughts racing through her mind. Harrison studied her for a long moment, as if expecting some reaction he could use to escalate the confrontation. When none came, he moved on to other topics, but Rebecca could feel his attention returning to her throughout the briefing like a weight pressing down on her shoulders. After the meeting, several colleagues approached Rebecca with whispered words of support. They understood what they had witnessed, the public humiliation disguised as performance management. But their sympathy came with limitations. Harrison had made it clear that supporting Rebecca could have consequences for their own careers. The message was received and understood. Rebecca was isolated, marked as a target, and expected to accept whatever treatment Harrison decided she deserved. The quiet contractor who had hoped to serve without notice was discovering that some fights couldn't be avoided, regardless of how far you ran or how deep you buried your past. That evening, Rebecca sat in her apartment staring at the wooden box she kept on her knit stand. Inside were 5 sets of dog tags, worn smooth by years of handling. 5 names that had trusted her with their lives and lost them anyway. The weight of those tags had driven her from a world where legends were born to one where she could serve without the burden of being remembered. But Harrison's campaign was threatening even this simple form of service. He was questioning not just her methods, but her right to be there, her worthiness to maintain the weapons that kept soldiers safe. The irony wasn't lost on her. The man who had never seen real combat was judging the competence of someone who had more experience with weapons than his entire command combined. Rebecca opened the box and lifted out the tags, letting them rest in her palm like a prayer. She whispered the names during her morning exercises, carried their memory in every weapon she maintained, honored their sacrifice in every act of service she performed. They had died because she hadn't been good enough, fast enough, perfect enough to save them. But they had also died believing in something larger than themselves, serving something more important than their own survival. The question now was whether she would let Harrison's petty tyranny destroy the only form of service she had left. Whether she would accept his judgment and walk away, or find another way to protect the work that gave her life meaning. As she returned the tags to their box, Rebecca felt something stirring inside her that she had worked hard to suppress. Not anger, exactly, but a kind of focused determination that had once made her name whispered in reverence and fear across 17 countries. She had chosen anonymity over recognition, service over glory, peace over conflict. But some battles chose you, regardless of what you wanted. And Rebecca Hayes was beginning to understand that her fight with Harrison was about more than just one woman's right to work in peace. It was about the principle that competence should matter more than connections, that service should be valued regardless of who provided it, that excellence shouldn't have to announce itself to be respected. The ghost was stirring, and Rebecca wasn't sure she had the strength to keep it buried much longer. Harrison's campaign against Rebecca escalated with each passing day, becoming more personal and increasingly difficult to ignore. He began showing up at her workstation multiple times daily, finding new ways to question her methods, her efficiency, and her right to be there. The harassment had evolved from professional criticism to something that felt deeply personal. The other maintenance staff grew increasingly uncomfortable with the situation. They watched Harrison's behavior with growing unease, recognizing the systematic nature of his campaign. Some tried to offer Rebecca subtle support, sharing workloads when possible, or providing silent gestures of solidarity. But their help came with limitations. Harrison's authority extended far beyond the maintenance bay, and everyone understood the cost of making him an enemy. Rebecca absorbed each slight with the same quiet acceptance she brought to everything else, but beneath the surface, something was changing. The careful control she had maintained for 3 years was beginning to crack under the constant pressure. She found herself thinking about the wooden box in her apartment more often, about the name she carried and the skills she had deliberately buried. The breaking point came during what should have been a routine equipment inspection. Harrison arrived with a delegation of officers, ostensibly to review maintenance protocols, but clearly designed to provide him with an audience for whatever he had planned. Rebecca watched them enter the facility with the same sinking feeling she had once experienced when spotting enemy movement through a rifle scope. "Today we're going to review some concerns about contractor performance," Harrison announced to the assembled group. Specifically, questions about whether civilian personnel truly understand the standards required in military maintenance. The words were carefully chosen, designed to question not just Rebecca's competence, but her right to work alongside military personnel. She felt the weight of every gaze in the room as Harrison prepared to make her an example of everything he believed was wrong with civilian contractors. "Hayes," Harrison called out, his voice carrying the authority of someone who had never doubted his right to judge others. "Bring me that rifle you were working on yesterday." Rebecca retrieved the weapon, a standard-issue rifle that she had completely disassembled and rebuilt as part of routine maintenance. Every component had been cleaned, inspected, and calibrated to specifications that exceeded military standards. She had performed the same procedure hundreds of times, with results that consistently impressed her supervisors. Harrison accepted the rifle with exaggerated care, as if handling equipment that might be dangerous due to incompetent maintenance. He examined it with theatrical thoroughness, making notes on his clipboard and exchanging meaningful looks with his audience. This trigger mechanism shows signs of excessive handling, Harrison announced, pointing to components that have been properly maintained according to established protocols. The kind of wear that suggests someone who doesn't understand the delicate balance required in military weapons. The accusation was absurd. Rebecca had maintained weapons with a level of precision that bordered on artistry, treating each rifle as if it might save someone's life in combat, because she understood better than most that it might. But explaining that would require revealing more than she was willing to share. "Sir, that rifle was maintained according to all established protocols," Rebecca replied, her voice steady despite the anger building inside her. Every component was inspected and calibrated to specifications. Harrison's expression suggested. He considered her response a form of insubordination. "Specifications, Hayes? Or your interpretation of specifications? Because there's a difference between following orders and following your own judgment." The emphasis on your own judgment made it clear that the criticism extended beyond technical competence to something more fundamental. Harrison wasn't just questioning her methods. He was questioning her right to make decisions about military equipment. The implication that she was somehow unqualified to maintain weapons that she understood better than anyone in the room was almost too much to bear. "I follow all established protocols, sir," Rebecca repeated, her voice carrying none of the thoughts racing through her mind. Harrison turned to address his audience, using Rebecca's presence as a teaching moment about the dangers of lowering standards. "This is what happens when we prioritize diversity over competence," he announced. "When we allow civilian contractors to handle equipment that should only be touched by qualified military personnel." The words hit Rebecca like a physical blow. She had spent 3 years proving her competence through flawless performance, had maintained weapons with a level of precision that consistently impressed her supervisors. But Harrison was reducing all of that to a diversity hire, a charity case who had been given opportunities she hadn't earned. Furthermore, Harrison continued, his confidence growing as he sensed no resistance from his target, "I have serious concerns about security protocols. Civilian contractors with access to military weapons require closer supervision than we've been providing." The implication was clear and devastating. Harrison wasn't just questioning her competence. He was questioning her loyalty, her trustworthiness, her right to be trusted with the weapons that kept soldiers safe. The accusation of potential security violations could end her career and destroy any chance of working in military contracting again. Rebecca felt something snap inside her, a control mechanism that had been under strain for weeks, finally reaching its breaking point. She had endured the harassment, absorbed the criticism, and accepted the systematic campaign to undermine her work. But this went too far. This threatened not just her job, but her identity, her sense of purpose, her ability to serve in the only way she had left. "Sir," she said, her voice carrying a new edge that made several people in the room look up with surprise. "I've maintained every weapon on this base to standards that have never been questioned by qualified supervisors. My work has consistently exceeded every metric established by this facility." Harrison's eyes narrowed at what he clearly perceived as unprecedented defiance. "Hayes, I think you're forgetting who you're talking to. I'm not interested in your excuses or your attempts to defend substandard performance." The dismissal was intended to end the conversation, to put Rebecca back in her place and demonstrate his authority to the assembled officers. But something in her expression made him pause, a stillness that didn't match the submissive contractor he had been systematically destroying. "With respect, sir," Rebecca continued, her voice carrying a quality that made the room grow quiet, "I'm not offering excuses. I'm stating facts. Every weapon I've maintained has performed flawlessly under the most demanding conditions. Every soldier who has carried equipment I've serviced has returned safely. That's not opinion, Colonel. That's measurable reality." The words hung in the air like a challenge. Harrison had expected submission, apology, maybe even tears. Instead, he faced quiet defiance backed by 3 years of flawless performance. The room watched in fascination as the dynamic shifted, as the quiet contractor revealed depths that no one had suspected. "Are you questioning my judgment, Hayes?" Harrison demanded, his voice rising with indignation. Rebecca met his gaze directly, her eyes carrying something that made several officers shift uncomfortably. "I'm questioning the basis for your conclusions, sir, because they don't match the evidence." The confrontation had escalated beyond what Harrison had intended. He had planned to humiliate a civilian contractor, to make an example that would reinforce his authority. Instead, he found himself facing someone who refused to be intimidated, who possessed a confidence that seemed completely out of place for her position. "You're dismissed, Hayes," Harrison said finally, his voice tight with barely controlled anger. "Report to my office tomorrow morning. We'll discuss your future here." Rebecca nodded once, her movements controlled and deliberate. She had crossed a line, challenged authority in a way that would have consequences. But she had also discovered something about herself that 3 years of careful anonymity had nearly buried. She wasn't just Rebecca Hayes, civilian contractor. She was someone who had faced down enemies in hostile territory, who had stared death in the face and pulled the trigger when necessary. As she left the facility, Rebecca felt the weight of every gaze following her. Some sympathetic, others merely curious about how this confrontation would unfold. But she also felt something else stirring inside her, something that had been dormant for too long. The ghost was waking up, and Rebecca wasn't sure she had the strength to keep it buried much longer. Rebecca spent the night staring at the wooden box on her nightstand, wrestling with decisions that would determine not just her future, but her identity. The confrontation with Harrison had awakened something she had worked hard to suppress, a part of herself that she had thought buried with her team in Afghanistan. The quiet contractor who had hoped to serve without notice was discovering that some fights couldn't be avoided. She opened the box and lifted out the dog tags, letting them rest in her palm like a prayer. 5 names that had trusted her with their lives and lost them anyway. The weight of those tags had driven her from a world where legends were born to one where she could serve without the burden of being remembered. But Harrison's campaign was threatening even this simple form of service. The morning brought new clarity. Rebecca arrived at the base early, as always, but this time she carried herself differently. The careful anonymity she had maintained for 3 years was beginning to crack, revealing glimpses of someone who had once commanded respect through competence rather than authority. She performed her morning ritual of push-ups with new purpose, each repetition a name, a promise, a reminder of why service mattered. Harrison's office was exactly what she expected. Military precision disguised as personal importance with awards, and photographs that spoke more to ambition than accomplishment. He kept her waiting for 20 minutes, a power play designed to emphasize the difference in their positions. When she was finally admitted, his expression made it clear that he expected submission and apology. "Hayes," he began, settling behind his desk with the confidence of someone who had never doubted his right to judge others. "I trust you've had time to reflect on yesterday's incident." Rebecca met his gaze directly, her eyes carrying something. That made him pause. "Yes, sir. I've reflected on a great deal." The response wasn't what Harrison had expected. He had planned to accept her apology and then outline the terms of her punishment. Instead, he found himself facing someone who possessed a confidence that seemed completely out of place for her position. "Good," Harrison said, recovering quickly. "Then you understand that your behavior yesterday was unacceptable." Questioning. A superior officer in front of witnesses cannot be tolerated. Rebecca nodded slowly, as if considering his words carefully. I understand your perspective, sir. But I also understand the difference between authority and competence. And I know the difference between following orders and following conscience. The words carried an edge that made Harrison's expression harden. He had expected contrition, maybe even tears. Instead, he faced quiet defiance backed by something he couldn't quite identify. The room felt smaller suddenly, as if the balance of power had shifted in ways he didn't understand. Are you threatening me, Hayes? Harrison demanded, his voice rising with indignation. Rebecca's response came quietly, but with absolute certainty. I'm stating facts, sir. My work has been flawless for 3 years. Every weapon I've maintained has performed exactly as designed. Every soldier who has carried equipment I've serviced has returned safely. That's not opinion, Colonel. That's measurable reality. Harrison leaned forward, his face flushed with anger. Your work? Hayes, you're a civilian contractor with no military background. You clean weapons according to procedures written by people who actually understand warfare. Don't confuse following instructions with expertise. The accusation hung in the air like a challenge. Rebecca felt something stirring inside her, a part of herself that had been dormant for too long. She had spent 3 years hiding her true capabilities, serving without recognition or glory. But Harrison's systematic campaign had pushed her to a breaking point where silence was no longer an option. You're right about one thing, sir, Rebecca said, her voice carrying a new quality that made Harrison pause. I do understand the difference between following instructions and having expertise. The question is whether you do. The confrontation had escalated beyond what either of them had planned. Harrison had expected to intimidate a civilian contractor into submission. Instead, he found himself facing someone who refused to be cowed, who possessed a confidence that seemed to grow with each exchange. You're dismissed, Hayes, Harrison said finally, his voice tight with barely controlled anger. Clean out your workstation. Your contract is terminated effective immediately. Rebecca stood slowly, her movements controlled and deliberate. She had known this moment would come, had prepared for it during the long night of reflection. But she had also made a decision that would change everything. Sir, she said, her voice carrying absolute certainty, I believe you should reconsider that decision. Harrison's eyes narrowed at what he clearly perceived as unprecedented defiance. Are you telling me how to run my command, Hayes? Rebecca met his gaze directly, her expression carrying something that made the room grow quiet. I'm telling you that you're making a mistake. A mistake that will reflect poorly on your judgment when the full truth comes out. The words carried an implication that made Harrison pause. There was something in her tone, in her bearing, that suggested she possessed information he didn't have. The quiet contractor who had been systematically destroyed was revealing depths that no one had suspected. What truth? Harrison demanded, his voice betraying the first hint of uncertainty. Rebecca's response came with the precision of someone who had calculated every word. The truth about competence versus authority, about service versus self-promotion, about the difference between earning respect and demanding it. She turned to leave, but Harrison's voice stopped her at the door. Hayes, I'm not finished with you. Rebecca looked back over her shoulder, her expression carrying something that made his blood run cold. Actually, sir, I think you are. But I'm not finished with you. The threat was subtle, but unmistakable. Harrison watched her leave with growing unease, sensing that something fundamental had changed in their dynamic. The quiet contractor who had absorbed weeks of harassment had revealed glimpses of someone who possessed capabilities he couldn't understand. As Rebecca walked back to the maintenance facility, she felt the weight of every gaze following her. Word of her termination had spread quickly, and her colleagues watched with expressions mixing sympathy with curiosity. They understood what they had witnessed, the public destruction of someone who had served faithfully for 3 years. But Rebecca carried herself differently now, with a confidence that seemed completely out of place for someone who had just lost her job. She began packing her tools with the same methodical precision she brought to everything else, but her movements carried new purpose. The careful anonymity she had maintained for 3 years was cracking, revealing glimpses of someone who had once commanded respect through competence rather than authority. Master Sergeant David Reynolds, the facility's senior enlisted advisor, approached her workstation with obvious concern. He had worked with Rebecca for 2 years and understood her capabilities better than most. Her termination made no sense from a performance standpoint. "Rebecca," he said quietly, "I want you to know that this doesn't reflect how any of us see your work. You've been the best contractor we've ever had." Rebecca looked up from her packing, her expression carrying something that made him pause. "Thank you, David. That means more than you know." Reynolds studied her face, noting something different in her bearing. "Are you going to be okay? Because I know some people who might be interested in your skills." Rebecca's smile carried depths that hadn't been there before. "I'll be fine, David. Sometimes things work out in ways we don't expect." The response puzzled him, but before he could ask for clarification, Rebecca had returned to her packing. She moved with new purpose, as if her termination had freed her from constraints that had been holding her back. The quiet contractor who had hoped to serve without notice was discovering that some fights were worth having, regardless of the cost. As she carried her tools to her truck, Rebecca felt something stirring inside her that had been dormant for too long. The ghost was waking up, and she wasn't sure she had the strength to keep it buried much longer. But maybe, she thought, it was time to stop trying. Harrison had made a mistake. He had pushed too hard, had threatened the only form of service she had left, and now he was about to discover that some people were dangerous precisely because they had nothing left to lose. The war between Colonel Harrison and Rebecca Hayes was about to begin in earnest, and Harrison had no idea what he had awakened. Rebecca's termination sent ripples through the base that Harrison hadn't anticipated. Within hours of her departure, 3 separate incidents occurred that would have been routine maintenance issues if she had still been there. A rifle that jammed during training exercises, a scope that lost calibration during a qualification course, a trigger mechanism that failed safety inspection. None of the incidents were catastrophic, but they highlighted the gap left by Rebecca's departure in ways that made Harrison increasingly uncomfortable. The remaining maintenance staff worked overtime to address the problems, but their efforts lacked the precision and efficiency that had made Rebecca's work legendary among those who understood weapons. Master Sergeant Reynolds found himself fielding questions from frustrated trainers about why equipment that had been flawlessly maintained for 3 years was suddenly experiencing problems. He knew the answer, but explaining it would require challenging Harrison's decision directly. Instead, he filed reports that documented the decreased efficiency and increased maintenance times without explicitly connecting them to Rebecca's termination. Meanwhile, Rebecca used her newfound freedom to investigate Harrison's background more thoroughly. She visited the base library, accessed public records, and made discreet inquiries among contacts who could provide information about officers who had served in Iraq. What she discovered painted a picture of a man whose reputation far exceeded his actual accomplishments. Harrison's service record showed 2 tours in Iraq, but both had been spent in administrative roles in the Green Zone. He had never seen combat, never commanded troops under fire, never faced the kind of life-or-death decisions that forged real military leaders. His awards and commendations reflected competent desk work rather than battlefield courage. The contrast between Harrison's self-presentation and his actual experience was stark. He spoke with the authority of someone who had led soldiers in combat, but his record showed someone who had managed paperwork while others fought. The medals he displayed prominently in his office were for administrative excellence and logistical support, not for valor or leadership under fire. Rebecca also discovered that Harrison's assignment to Fort Benning had come after a complaint about his management style at his previous posting. The details were buried in personnel files she couldn't access, but the pattern was clear. Harrison had been transferred to a position where his authority was limited and his impact on operational readiness was minimal. The investigation revealed something else that made Rebecca's blood run cold. Harrison had been quietly targeting other civilian contractors, using the same systematic harassment tactics he had employed against her. 3 contractors had been terminated in the past 6 months, all women, all with performance records that exceeded established standards. The pattern was unmistakable. Harrison wasn't just incompetent. He was actively dangerous to the bases. Operational readiness. His campaign against qualified personnel was degrading the very capabilities he was supposed to protect. The irony wasn't lost on Rebecca. The man who questioned her commitment to military excellence was actively undermining it through his own prejudices and insecurities. Armed with this information, Rebecca began reaching out to contacts she had avoided for 3 years. The military community was smaller than most people realized, especially among those who had served in special operations. Phone calls were made, emails were sent, and old debts of trust were quietly called in. The response was immediate and overwhelming. Within 48 hours, Rebecca had compiled a dossier on Harrison that revealed the full scope of his incompetence. Former colleagues spoke privately about his failures of leadership, his tendency to take credit for others' work, and his pattern of targeting subordinates who threatened his authority through their competence. More importantly, Rebecca discovered that several high-ranking officers had been quietly monitoring Harrison's performance at Fort Benning. His systematic harassment of civilian contractors had not gone unnoticed, but they had been waiting for someone to file a formal complaint. Rebecca's termination had provided the catalyst they needed to take action. Commander Marcus Torres arrived at Fort Benning 3 days after Rebecca's termination, ostensibly for a routine inspection of training protocols. But his real purpose was to investigate reports of declining maintenance standards and contractor harassment. Torres had served with distinction in multiple combat zones and understood the critical importance of weapons maintenance to soldier safety. Torres's inspection was thorough and methodical. He reviewed maintenance records, interviewed staff, and personally examined weapons that had been serviced by different contractors. The difference in quality between Rebecca's work and that of her replacements was immediately apparent to someone with his experience. When Torres requested to speak with Rebecca Hayes, Harrison's response was telling. He provided a lengthy explanation of why her contract had been terminated, emphasizing security concerns and performance issues that had no basis in documented fact. Torres listened with professional courtesy, but his expression grew increasingly skeptical as Harrison's accusations became more elaborate. "Colonel," Torres interrupted finally, "I've reviewed Hayes's performance records. They show 3 years of flawless service with consistently high ratings from every supervisor except you. Can you explain this discrepancy?" Harrison's face flushed with anger at what he perceived as an attack on his authority. "Commander, with respect, you haven't worked with Hayes directly. I have observed problems that may not be apparent in written reports." Torres nodded thoughtfully, making notes on his clipboard. "I see. And these problems coincided with your arrival at Fort Benning?" "Because the timeline suggests that Hayes's performance ratings declined only after you began supervising her work." The implication was clear and damaging. Harrison had created problems where none had existed, had manufactured reasons to target a contractor whose work had been exemplary under previous supervision. His systematic campaign was documented in his own reports, creating a paper trail that revealed more about his prejudices than her performance. "Commander," Harrison said, his voice tight with barely controlled frustration, "I believe my authority to evaluate contractor performance is well established. I don't appreciate having my judgment questioned." Torres's response was measured but firm. "Colonel, your authority to evaluate performance is indeed established. Your judgment, however, is subject to review when it impacts operational readiness, and declining maintenance standards directly impact the safety of our soldiers." The conversation continued for another hour, with Torres systematically dismantling Harrison's justifications for Rebecca's termination. Every accusation was countered with documented evidence of her competence. Every security concern was revealed as baseless speculation. Every performance issue was shown to be a manufactured complaint. Meanwhile, Rebecca received a phone call that changed everything. Commander Torres had requested a meeting, not as a terminated contractor, but as someone whose expertise might be valuable to ongoing operations. The call came through channels that Rebecca hadn't used in 3 years. Contacts who understood exactly who she was and what she was capable of. The meeting was scheduled for the next morning, away from the base and away from Harrison's influence. Rebecca arrived with the dossier she had compiled on Harrison's background, prepared to present evidence that would expose his systematic harassment of qualified personnel. Torres greeted her with the respect of one professional acknowledging another. He had done his own research, had made his own inquiries, and had reached conclusions that would have shocked Harrison if he had been present to hear them. "Ms. Hayes," Torres began, "I believe we need to discuss not just your termination, but the circumstances that led to it. And perhaps more importantly, we need to discuss who you really are." The words hung in the air like a challenge. Rebecca had spent 3 years hiding her true identity, serving without recognition or glory. But Torres's expression suggested that her carefully maintained anonymity had been penetrated by someone who understood the value of her real capabilities. "I'm not sure what you mean, sir," Rebecca replied, though her tone suggested she understood exactly what he meant. Torres smiled slightly, the expression of someone who had solved a puzzle that had been troubling him. "I think you do, Ms. Hayes, or should I say Ghost?" The name hit Rebecca like a physical blow. She had spent 3 years believing that her past was buried, that her service record was classified beyond any possibility of discovery. But Torres's expression made it clear that some secrets were impossible to keep from those who knew where to look. "I don't know what you're talking about," Rebecca said, but her voice lacked conviction. Torres leaned forward, his expression serious. 322 confirmed kills across 17 countries. 47 high-value targets eliminated with surgical precision that defied physics and probability. The only woman to complete SEAL training without a single modified standard. The Jakarta shot that saved an entire diplomatic convoy. Each detail landed with the force of absolute truth. Rebecca felt the carefully constructed walls of her anonymity crumbling as Torres revealed the extent of his knowledge. The ghost that she had thought buried was being systematically exhumed by someone who understood exactly what he was dealing with. "That person is dead," Rebecca said finally, her voice carrying the weight of loss and regret. "She died with her team in Afghanistan." Torres nodded with understanding. "Maybe she did. But the person sitting across from me maintained weapons for 3 years with a level of precision that only someone with her skills could achieve. The person Harrison targeted and terminated is someone whose expertise exceeds that of anyone on this base." The conversation that followed revealed the full scope of what Torres had discovered. Harrison's systematic harassment had been documented and investigated. His pattern of targeting qualified personnel had been exposed and analyzed. His impact on operational readiness had been measured and found wanting. More importantly, Torres had authorization to take corrective action. Harrison's career at Fort Benning was over, and his influence over contractor assignments was terminated immediately. Rebecca's contract would be reinstated with a formal apology and compensation for wrongful termination. But Torres offered something more than just vindication. He offered Rebecca the chance to serve in a capacity that would utilize her real capabilities to train the next generation of soldiers in skills that could save their lives in combat. "The choice is yours," Torres said. "You can return to maintenance work, serving quietly as you have for 3 years. Or you can step out of the shadows and teach others what you know. Help them become the kind of soldiers who might survive what your team didn't." The offer hung in the air like a lifeline. Rebecca had spent 3 years serving without recognition, hiding her capabilities behind the mask of ordinary competence. But Torres was offering her the chance to serve openly, to use her skills to prepare others for the challenges she had faced. It was a chance to honor the memory of her fallen team by ensuring that future soldiers were better prepared, better trained, better equipped to survive in hostile territory. It was a chance to transform her guilt into purpose, her loss into legacy. Rebecca looked at Torres with new understanding. "What exactly are you proposing, sir?" The smile that crossed his face was answer enough. The ghost was about to rise from the grave, and Harrison was about to discover that some enemies were far more dangerous than he had ever imagined. Commander Torres's investigation moved with military efficiency and devastating thoroughness. Within 72 hours of his arrival, he had compiled a comprehensive report that documented Harrison's systematic harassment of civilian contractors, his impact on operational readiness, and his pattern of manufacturing complaints against qualified personnel. The report painted a picture of leadership failure that went beyond simple incompetence. Harrison had actively degraded the base's capabilities through his prejudices and insecurities, creating problems where none had existed and driving away expertise that was crucial to soldier safety. The evidence was overwhelming and undeniable. Harrison remained unaware of the investigation until Torres requested a formal meeting with the base commander. The session was scheduled for Thursday morning, with Harrison's presence required to address concerns about contractor management and operational readiness. He attended expecting to defend his decisions, not his career. The conference room was filled with officers whose ranks and experience dwarfed Harrison's credentials. Base Commander Colonel Patricia Williams presided over the meeting with the authority of someone who had earned respect through competence rather than politics. Torres presented his findings with clinical precision, allowing the evidence to speak for itself. "Colonel Harrison," Williams began, her voice carrying the weight of absolute authority, "we're here to discuss serious concerns about your management of civilian contractors and the impact on this base's operational readiness." Harrison's face flushed with indignation at what he perceived as an attack on his authority. "Ma'am, I believe my evaluation methods are well within established parameters. I've been implementing necessary corrections to substandard performance." Torres looked up from his report, his expression skeptical. "Colonel, could you explain why maintenance efficiency has declined by 30% since Miss Hayes' termination? Why 3 separate equipment failures occurred in the first week after her departure?" The question struck at the heart of Harrison's justifications. His campaign against Rebecca had been based on manufactured complaints about her performance, but the actual results of her absence told a different story. The base's operational readiness had measurably declined without her expertise. "Those incidents were coincidental," Harrison replied, his voice betraying growing uncertainty. "Equipment failures happen regardless of maintenance personnel." Williams consulted the report in front of her, her expression growing increasingly skeptical. "Colonel, this analysis shows that equipment failures under Hayes' maintenance were virtually non-existent. 3 years of service with 0 documented failures. Can you explain why her termination was necessary given this record?" Harrison's prepared justifications crumbled under scrutiny that revealed them as baseless speculation rather than documented fact. Every accusation he had made was countered with evidence of Rebecca's competence. Every security concern was shown to be manufactured prejudice. Every performance issue was exposed as systematic harassment. Furthermore, Torres continued, his voice carrying the authority of verified truth, our investigation has revealed that Ms. Hayes possesses qualifications that far exceed those of any maintenance personnel on this base. Qualifications that you were apparently unaware of when you terminated her contract. The implication hung in the air like a challenge. Harrison had destroyed the career of someone whose expertise exceeded his own, had driven away capabilities that were crucial to the base's mission. His ignorance of Rebecca's true qualifications made his actions appear even more egregious. I evaluated Hayes based on her documented civilian background, Harrison protested. Her personnel file shows no military experience, no formal training beyond basic firearms courses. Torres' smile carried no warmth. Colonel, personnel files show what individuals want them to show. Ms. Hayes' actual qualifications are classified at levels you don't have access to. But I can tell you that she has more combat experience than everyone in this room combined. The revelation struck Harrison like a physical blow. He had spent weeks systematically destroying someone whose credentials made his own service appear insignificant by comparison. The quiet contractor he had dismissed as a diversity hire possessed capabilities that he couldn't comprehend. That's impossible, Harrison managed, his voice cracking with disbelief. Hayes is just a civilian contractor with no military background. Williams looked at Harrison with growing disappointment. Colonel, your inability to recognize expertise when it's serving under your command raises serious questions about your fitness for leadership. You've systematically harassed and ultimately terminated the most qualified maintenance contractor this base has ever had. The meeting continued for another hour, with Torres methodically presenting evidence of Harrison's failures. His pattern of targeting female contractors was documented and analyzed. His impact on morale and operational readiness was measured and found catastrophic. His abuse of authority was exposed as a pattern of behavior that had followed him from previous assignments. As the evidence mounted, Harrison's defense became increasingly desperate. He accused Torres of bias, questioned the validity of classified information he couldn't access, and suggested that the investigation was motivated by political correctness rather than operational concerns. But every accusation only revealed his own prejudices more clearly. His inability to recognize Rebecca's qualifications spoke to a fundamental failure of leadership. His systematic harassment demonstrated a pattern of behavior that was incompatible with military values. His impact on operational readiness showed that his authority had been used to degrade rather than enhance the base's capabilities. The meeting concluded with Harrison's immediate suspension pending a formal review of his conduct. His authority over contractor assignments was terminated, and his access to personnel files was revoked. The investigation would continue, but his career at Fort Benning was effectively over. Meanwhile, Rebecca received another phone call that changed everything. Commander Torres had authorization to offer her a position that would utilize her real capabilities, a chance to serve openly rather than hiding behind manufactured anonymity. The offer came with rank recognition and the opportunity to train the next generation of soldiers in skills that could save their lives. The irony wasn't lost on her. Harrison's campaign to destroy her had instead revealed her true value to those who understood excellence when they saw it. His systematic harassment had backfired spectacularly, exposing his own incompetence while highlighting her expertise. But Rebecca's response surprised everyone who thought they understood her. Motivations. She declined the offer of rank and recognition. choosing instead to return to Fort Benning as a civilian instructor with authority to establish training programs that emphasize precision, discipline, and the kind of attention to detail that separated life from death in combat situations. "I'm not interested in titles or ceremonies," she told Torres during their final meeting. "I'm interested in making sure the next generation of soldiers is better prepared than my team was. Better trained, better equipped, better led." Torres nodded with understanding. "And Harrison? What do you want to see happen to him?" Rebecca's answer revealed the depth of her character and the source of her strength. "I want him to understand the difference between authority and competence, between commanding respect and earning it, between serving yourself and serving something larger." The response was more devastating than any formal punishment could have been. Rebecca wasn't seeking revenge. She was seeking justice. Not for herself, but for every qualified person who had been driven away by leaders who confused prejudice with judgment. Harrison's confrontation with the truth came when he was summoned to a final meeting with Base Commander Williams. The session was brief and final. His career at Fort Benning terminated with prejudice, and his conduct documented in a way that would follow him for the rest of his military service. But the real reckoning came when Harrison encountered Rebecca outside the base commander's office. She was returning from a meeting about her new position, carrying herself with the confidence of someone whose value had finally been recognized. Their eyes met for a moment that contained entire conversations. "Hayes," Harrison said, his voice lacking the authority it had once carried. Rebecca studied him with the dispassion of someone evaluating a tactical situation. "Colonel, I hope you've learned something from this experience." Harrison's face flushed with anger and humiliation. "You destroyed my career." Rebecca's response came with the precision of someone who understood exactly what had happened. "No, sir. You destroyed your own career when you confused prejudice with leadership. I just gave you enough rope to hang yourself with." The words carried no anger, no satisfaction, just a terrible clarity of absolute truth. Harrison had created his own downfall through his systematic harassment of qualified personnel. Rebecca had simply documented his failures and presented them to people who understood the value of competence over connections. As Harrison walked away from Fort Benning for the last time, Rebecca felt something that she hadn't experienced in 3 years. Not satisfaction, exactly, but a sense that justice had been served. That excellence had been recognized and incompetence had been exposed. The ghost was rising from the grave, and she was bringing with her the promise that future soldiers would be better prepared for the challenges that had claimed her team. Harrison's campaign to destroy her had instead revealed her true value, transforming a maintenance contractor into an instructor whose influence would be felt for generations. The war was over, and competence had triumphed over authority. But for Rebecca, the real victory wasn't Harrison's defeat. It was the opportunity to serve openly, to honor her fallen team by preparing others for survival in a world where precision meant the difference between coming home and a folded flag. Word of Harrison's downfall spread through Fort Benning with the speed of wildfire. Within hours, the story had transformed from whispered speculation to confirmed fact. The colonel who had terrorized civilian contractors was gone, his authority stripped away by an investigation that had exposed systematic harassment and operational incompetence. But the bigger story was just beginning to emerge. Rebecca Hayes, the quiet maintenance contractor who had absorbed weeks of abuse without complaint, was scheduled to address the entire base during the next mandatory formation. The announcement came through official channels, but the undercurrents of anticipation suggested that something extraordinary was about to happen. The formation assembled on Thursday morning with an energy that was unusual for routine administrative briefings. Soldiers who had witnessed Harrison's campaign against Rebecca mixed with others who had only heard rumors about the investigation. The maintenance staff stood together, their expressions mixing vindication with curiosity about what their former colleague might reveal. Commander Torres introduced Rebecca with words that made the assembled soldiers lean forward with interest. Today you'll hear from someone whose service to this country exemplifies the highest ideals of military excellence. Someone whose expertise has been hidden in plain sight, maintaining the weapons that keep you safe with a level of precision that few people could achieve. Rebecca approached the podium with the same measured steps she had used to walk to her workstation every morning for 3 years. But something fundamental had changed in her bearing. The careful anonymity she had maintained was gone, replaced by the quiet confidence of someone who no longer needed to hide her capabilities. She looked out over the assembled soldiers, her gaze taking in faces she had served without recognition, weapons she had maintained without glory, young men and women who deserved to know the truth about excellence and service and the difference between authority and competence. "My name is Rebecca Hayes," she began, her voice carrying clearly across the formation. "For 3 years, I've maintained your weapons. I've ensured that every rifle, every scope, every trigger mechanism met the standards that might save your life in combat. You knew me as a civilian contractor who kept to herself and did good work." The formation listened with growing attention as Rebecca continued. "What you didn't know is that I understood those weapons better than most because I had used them in combat. Because I had carried them through 73 operations across 17 countries. Because I had trusted my life to equipment maintained by people who understood that precision isn't just a technical requirement. It's the difference between coming home and a folded flag." The revelation rippled through the formation like electricity. Soldiers who had worked alongside Rebecca for years suddenly understood that the quiet contractor had been something extraordinary, hiding in plain sight. The maintenance staff felt vindicated in their respect for her work, understanding now why her standards had been so exacting. "I came to Fort Benning not for recognition or advancement," Rebecca continued, "but for the chance to serve without the burden of being a legend. To maintain weapons with the knowledge that every rifle I touched might keep someone's son or daughter alive in places where precision determined survival." Her voice carried the weight of hard-won experience as she described a different kind of service. Not the glory of special operations, but the quiet dedication of ensuring that others would be better prepared for challenges she had faced. The humility of expertise applied without fanfare, competence demonstrated through results rather than rhetoric. Colonel Harrison questioned my qualifications because he couldn't see past his own assumptions. He created problems where none existed, because he confused authority with competence. He degraded this base's operational readiness because he let prejudice override judgment. The condemnation was delivered without anger, but with the terrible clarity of absolute truth. Harrison's failures were exposed not through personal attack, but through the simple recitation of facts that spoke for themselves. The real tragedy, Rebecca continued, isn't what he did to me. It's what he did to this base's culture. He created an environment where competence was questioned, where excellence was suspect, where service without recognition was dismissed as inadequacy. The formation listened in complete silence as Rebecca painted a picture of leadership failure that went beyond simple harassment. Harrison had systematically undermined the values that made military service meaningful, had confused position with purpose, had forgotten that true authority came from earning respect rather than demanding it. "But this isn't about Colonel Harrison," Rebecca said, her voice growing stronger. "This is about the choice every leader faces between building others up or tearing them down, between recognizing excellence wherever it appears or only valuing what fits your expectations." She paused, her gaze sweeping across the formation with the intensity of someone who had seen too much to waste words on empty platitudes. "I'm returning to Fort Benning not as a maintenance contractor, but as an instructor. Not to hide my capabilities, but to share them. Not to serve without recognition, but to prepare you for the challenges that claim my team. The announcement transformed the entire dynamic of the formation. Rebecca wasn't just returning. She was emerging from anonymity to take on a role that would utilize her real capabilities. The ghost was rising from the grave, bringing with her expertise that could save lives and knowledge that had been earned through terrible cost. My team died in Afghanistan because we weren't prepared for what we faced. Rebecca continued, her voice carrying the weight of memory and loss. Not because we lacked courage or training, but because we trusted incomplete intelligence and underestimated our enemies. They died believing in something larger than themselves, serving something more important than their own survival. The formation felt the shift from administrative briefing to something approaching sacred testimony. Rebecca was sharing not just her credentials, but her scars. Not just her expertise, but her vulnerability. The quiet contractor was revealing herself as someone who had paid the ultimate price for service and chosen to transform that loss into legacy. Their sacrifice will not be meaningless if I can prepare you better than we were prepared. If I can teach you to see what we missed, to question what we accepted, to survive what we didn't. Rebecca's voice grew stronger as she described her vision for training that went beyond technical competence to tactical wisdom. Programs that emphasized attention to detail, situational awareness, and the kind of thinking that separated survivors from casualties in hostile environments. Excellence doesn't announce itself, she concluded. It demonstrates itself through results. Competence speaks through action, not argument. True strength lies in lifting others to heights they never thought possible. The formation stood in complete silence as Rebecca stepped back from the podium. The transformation was complete. The quiet contractor had become an instructor whose influence would be felt for generations. The ghost had risen from the grave, bringing with her the promise that future soldiers would be better prepared for the challenges that had claimed her. Team Commander Torres returned to the podium with obvious satisfaction. Ms. Hayes will be establishing new training protocols that emphasize precision, discipline, and tactical thinking. These programs will be mandatory for all personnel and will represent some of the most advanced instruction available anywhere in the military. The announcement was met with genuine enthusiasm from soldiers who understood they were being offered training from someone whose credentials exceeded those of any instructor they had ever encountered. The quiet contractor had become a legend. In plain sight, her expertise finally recognized and utilized. As the formation dispersed, Rebecca found herself surrounded by soldiers seeking guidance, asking questions, and expressing gratitude for her willingness to share knowledge that had been earned through terrible cost. The isolation she had maintained for 3 years was replaced by engagement that felt meaningful and purposeful. Master Sergeant Reynolds approached her with obvious respect. "Ma'am, I always knew your work was special, but I never imagined it came from experience like that." Rebecca's response reflected the humility that had defined her service. "The work was always the important part, David. The background just explains why I took it seriously." The simplicity of her answer captured everything that Harrison had failed to understand. Excellence didn't require recognition to be valuable. Competence didn't need titles to be effective. Service without glory was still service, and often the most meaningful kind. As Rebecca walked back toward the maintenance facility that would soon become a training center, she felt something she hadn't experienced in 3 years. Not satisfaction exactly, but a sense that her suffering had found purpose. That her team's sacrifice would live on through every soldier she prepared for survival. The ghost had risen from the grave, and she was bringing with her the promise that excellence would be recognized, competence would be valued, and service would be honored regardless of who provided it. Harrison's campaign to destroy her had instead revealed her true value, transforming a maintenance contractor into an instructor whose influence would echo through military culture for generations. The war was over, and truth had triumphed over prejudice. But for Rebecca, the real victory was just beginning. The chance to serve openly, to honor her fallen team, and to ensure that future soldiers would be better prepared for the challenges that awaited them in a world where precision meant the difference between coming home and a folded flag. 6 months after Harrison's departure, Fort Benning had transformed into something approaching Rebecca's vision of military excellence. The training programs she established emphasized fundamentals that went beyond technical competence to tactical wisdom, preparing soldiers not just to use their weapons, but to think like warriors who understood that survival depended on attention to detail and respect for their equipment. Rebecca's morning routine had evolved but retained its essential character. She still arrived at 5 o'clock sharp, still performed her ritual of remembrance, but now her presence served a different purpose. Instead of maintaining weapons in solitude, she prepared to share knowledge that had been earned through terrible cost with soldiers who deserved to benefit from her experience. The training facility that had once been a simple maintenance bay now housed some of the most advanced marksmanship instruction available anywhere in the military. Rebecca had designed courses that challenged conventional thinking about precision shooting, incorporating lessons learned in combat environments that textbooks couldn't capture. Her students called her Ms. Hayes with a reverence that had nothing to do with rank and everything to do with results. She deflected their attempts at hero worship with practiced ease, focusing instead on fundamentals that could save their lives in situations she prayed they would never face. Excellence isn't about being perfect, she told each new class. It's about being prepared, about understanding your equipment so completely that it becomes an extension of yourself, about maintaining standards even when no one is watching, especially when no one is watching. The lessons went beyond marksmanship to encompass leadership, judgment, and the kind of thinking that separated technicians from artists. Rebecca taught breathing techniques that calmed racing hearts, visualization that turned pressure into precision, and most importantly, the mental discipline that enabled soldiers to perform when everything went wrong. Her influence extended far beyond the shooting range. The culture of Fort Benning had shifted subtly but significantly in ways that honored competence over connections, results over rhetoric. Other civilian contractors found themselves treated with increased respect, as people began to understand that expertise came in many forms. Commander Torres visited regularly, ostensibly to review training protocols but actually to witness the transformation Rebecca had brought to the base. The decline in equipment failures had been dramatic and immediate. More importantly, soldiers trained under her programs demonstrated measurably improved performance in combat simulations and qualification courses. She's exceeded every expectation, Torres reported to his superiors. Hayes has created training programs that prepare soldiers for challenges they might face in combat environments. The improvement in precision, discipline, and tactical thinking has been remarkable. The young female soldier who had first asked Rebecca for training became her most dedicated student and eventually her assistant instructor. Lieutenant Ashley Morgan absorbed lessons that went far beyond trigger control and wind calls, learning about leadership, service, and the difference between commanding respect and earning it. What's the most important thing you've learned? Morgan asked during one of their morning preparation sessions. Rebecca's answer reflected the wisdom she had gained through loss and service, that true warriors don't seek war. They seek peace, understanding that violence is sometimes necessary, but never glorious. When that peace faces threats, real warriors don't announce their presence with boasts or bravado. They simply do what must be done with competence and humility. The shadow box that Torres had given her remained in the training facility, A reminder and inspiration for students who studied the medals and ribbons that represented service beyond anything they had experienced. One asked about a particular commendation, its meaning lost in military symbolism that existed at classification levels they would never reach. "That's a reminder," Rebecca explained. "That honor doesn't need announcement. Every medal in that box represents a moment when doing the right thing mattered more than who got credit. The real reward was coming home and others didn't, carrying their memory forward in how we serve." The wooden box remained in her apartment, but its meaning had evolved. The 5 sets of dog tags still rested inside, worn smooth by years of handling, but they no longer represented just loss and guilt. They had become symbols of purpose, driving her to ensure that future soldiers would be better prepared for the challenges that had claimed her team. On quiet mornings when mist clung to the shooting range like memory, Rebecca set up impossible shots that no student witnessed. The rifle spoke its ancient language of physics and precision, bullets flying true across distances that challenged belief. She took these shots not to maintain skills that would never again be used in anger, but to honor promises made to the dead. Each perfect impact represented a life that continued to matter, a soul whose sacrifice shaped every lesson she taught. The names she whispered during those solitary moments had found new purpose, their memory living on through every soldier she prepared for survival. News of Harrison's final disposition reached Fort Benning through official channels that carried no satisfaction, only closure. His military career had ended with administrative separation and documentation that would follow him forever. He had learned in the most painful way possible the difference between authority and competence, between commanding respect and earning it. But Rebecca's thoughts about Harrison had evolved beyond simple justice to something approaching pity. He had destroyed his own career through prejudice and insecurity, had missed the opportunity to learn from someone whose expertise exceeded his own understanding. His loss was complete and self-inflicted, a cautionary tale about the dangers of letting assumption override observation. The real victory wasn't Harrison's defeat, but the transformation of Fort Benning into a place where excellence was recognized and nurtured regardless of its source. Rebecca's influence extended through every soldier she trained, every instructor she mentored, every standard she established that emphasized precision over politics. Years later, when Rebecca's time at Fort Benning drew to a close, her departure was marked not by ceremony but by absence. She left the way she had arrived, quietly and without fanfare. But the program she established continued, the standards she set endured, and the culture she influenced lived on through generations of soldiers who carried her lessons into service. Somewhere in a small town far from any military base, an instructor named Rebecca teaches precision to hunters and sport shooters with the same patient dedication she brought to training warriors. She never mentions her past unless directly relevant, never trades on former glory for present respect. Her students know her as an exceptional teacher with an uncanny ability to diagnose and correct shooting problems, nothing more. The ghosts still whisper in quiet moments, 5 names carried forever. But they no longer define her present or limit her future. They have become sources of strength rather than symbols of failure, driving her to excellence in service of those who trust. There lives the skills she helps them develop. Do you believe true strength speaks louder than words? Rebecca Hayes' journey from legendary operator to humble instructor reminds us that the greatest warriors often fight their most important battles in silence, measuring victory not in accolades, but in the lives they touch and the service they render without recognition. Sometimes the most powerful thing we can do is step back from the spotlight and use our expertise to illuminate the path for others. Her story echoes through Fort Benning and beyond, a reminder that heroes walk among us in unexpected forms. The quiet maintenance worker, the patient instructor, the colleague who never speaks of their past. Each might carry histories of extraordinary service masked by ordinary presence. Rebecca chose anonymity over acclaim, teaching over commanding, service over self. In doing so, she embodied the highest ideals of warrior culture, proving that true strength needs no announcement, only application. The morning sun cast long shadows across empty ranges and busy training facilities. Across institutions where future warriors learn their craft and quiet workshops where expertise meets humility, Rebecca Hayes continues her work one student at a time, one lesson at a time, one act of service at a time. The ghost may have died in Afghanistan, but what rose from that tragedy was something more powerful than any legend. A teacher who understood that the greatest victory lies not in defeating enemies, but in preparing others to protect what matters most. Her shadow stretches long across the landscape of military culture, a reminder that true warriors serve not for glory, but for those who cannot serve themselves. And when that service is complete, they fade back into the shadows where legends live, content in the knowledge that their duty continues through every life they have touched, every standard they have set, every lesson they have taught about. The difference between excellence and expectation, between service and self-promotion, between earning respect and demanding it. The legacy lives on, whispered through the ranks of soldiers who learned precision from someone who understood its life or death importance, carried forward by instructors who teach with the patience of someone who knows that preparation prevents. Tragedy, embodied in the culture of institutions that value competence over connections and results over rhetoric. Rebecca Hayes proved that true strength lies not in proving our worth to critics, but in continuing our work regardless of recognition. That the most powerful response to disrespect might be the quiet dignity of competence. That excellence speaks through actions, not arguments, and that the greatest warriors are often those who serve without fanfare, teach without ego, and measure success by the lives they help save rather than the glory they achieve. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to hit the subscribe button and become a part of our Everyday Life Stories community. Where are you watching from? Drop a comment below. We love hearing from our amazing viewers around the world.